It was early 1942. In North Africa, forces of the German Reich swept relentlessly forward. Much of Western Europe was already under Nazi occupation. The United States, still reeling from the tragedy of Pearl Harbor, geared for global war. The Allies, outmanned and outgunned, hung on, wondering if they would survive. At home, we hoped that much would stay the same, but we knew that much would change. One of our heroes was Babe Ruth, and as the war intensified, another hero, heavyweight champion Joe Louis, got into the uniform that would become all too familiar.
In all seriousness, Army is a fine place for a fighter. Just keep your legs in good shape, keep your wind in good shape. All I have to do now is take off a little weight and sharpen up on my punching.
Austerity became the byword. Sirloin steak was 35 cents a pound, if you could get it. There were shortages everywhere, and gasoline rationing began. Into the turmoil of 1942 came one of the most amazing experiences of medical history. We are in the beautiful town of Washington, Connecticut. The people are Mr. and Mrs. Ogden Miller. Today, they live here in a quiet life of retirement. Before retiring, Ogden Miller was an administrator at Yale University, New Haven, and later headmaster of a boys' school. His wife, Ann, worked as a registered nurse. They have 3 sons. It is Mrs. Ann Miller who received an incredible gift of life in 1942. In the years to follow, millions of people the world over would also receive that gift of life. Mrs. Miller was the first American to be saved by penicillin, and the word penicillin became part of the language of the world. You are about to relive Mrs. Miller's ordeal and her miraculous recovery with many of the people who worked to save her life.
I was taken to the hospital at night, having had supposedly a miscarriage. I had been taking care of a 3-year-old boy who'd been ill, and I was awakened with these symptoms, and the ambulance came and took me to the New Haven hospital, and I was admitted to isolation. I remember being put to bed. I remember having one operation of a dilatation and curettage, returning to my room, and I was on floor care. At that time, I began to run a temperature. And I remember getting out of bed to find the lavatory, which I shouldn't have done, and the nurse found me on the floor. From then on, I had nurses. My next remembrance is the fact that I had a very sore left ankle, and I evidently had an infection in it, which was treated by being in a cast. And from then on, I did become increasingly unaware of what was going on due to my high temperature.
I was doing private duty, and they called me in to work the 3 to 11 shift with her. And I went to work that afternoon at 3, and my first sight of Mrs. Miller was in this bare isolation room, and her husband had given her some beautiful roses. And when I walked in, she had been very carefully pulling off all the leaves from the roses, and there was a pile of leaves on the floor, and that was my first job, was to rescue the rest of the roses. Most of them were pretty well free of leaves at that point. But she was confused. She'd been spiking a temperature, and it would go real high. I don't remember how high, but very high. And she'd be so warm, and I'd have to take the blankets off and open the windows and try to cool her down. I imagine I gave her alcohol sponges too, probably. And then she would have chills, and I'd have to put blankets on, close the windows, and put hot water bottles on, and try to get her warmed up again. And this went on with no relief at all.
At that time, I was serving an internship in the New Haven hospital.
This is Dr. Lloyd Brown, now a practicing surgeon in Bangor, Maine. In 1942, when Mrs. Miller was stricken and taken to what is now known as the Yale New Haven Medical Center, Dr. Brown was a young resident in training there. Mrs. Miller was dying. The doctors tried everything to pull her through. Even surgery was attempted as a desperation measure. Dr. Brown describes what took place.
I did hear about it, perhaps before I came in contact with her. I first came into contact with her when the question of performing an operation to try to eliminate the infection from her body, which she had developed. She was obviously getting worse. More or less in desperation, I assisted the then one of the outstanding obstetricians and gynecologists in New Haven at that time, Dr. Creddick, in an operation in an effort to remove the infection from her body. This was unsuccessful as far as eliminating the infection was concerned, and she continued to run high fever daily and was obviously getting worse. We then heard about some rumors about this new medicine, penicillin. We'd had no experience with it. We knew nothing about it except what was the scuttlebutt, you might say.
After she'd been operated on 2 times, all that could be done for her surgically had been done. She was transferred over to the isolation service in medicine, in which I was very much the low man on the totem pole. I was the junior intern on that service. It was perfectly obvious this woman was acutely ill, and if we didn't have something further to offer her, she would die.
Dr. John Bumstead had been our friend for many years, and he would talk to me. He would say, we're going to keep trying, and I have, you've had a certain amount of sulfadiazine. It hasn't done you much good. Then I had a serum for scarlet fever, and then another one for rattlesnake bite, I think you would call it. But during all this time, of course, I was being kept alive by almost constant blood transfusions and crises, as we called them in those days, intravenous. I was getting fluid into my legs and my arms, and then blood into my veins. But each time Dr. Bumstead, he came in, he would look at me and talk with Miss Ryder. And I don't really remember the day that they said we have still one more thing to try, because I was too sick by then.
As the doctors who were in charge of my sister-in-law's case were racking their brains on what they could do for this patient, having tried everything that they could think of without avail, and she continued to go downhill. Talking one night together, they, in racking their brains on what more could they do for her, remembered that this new substance, which seemed to be very effective in many infections, had been developed in England, and at 2 a.m. in the morning, having thought and recalled of this instance, got in contact with the pharmaceutical house and asked them if they had any on hand, and they said, yes, we have 1 gram of it extracted and refined.
This is Dr. Alexander Fleming, the British scientist who discovered penicillin. During the early part of World War II, penicillin would be developed for treatment by still 2 other brilliant British scientists, Drs. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain. All 3 won the Nobel Prize for their work. But in wartime England, shortages prevented immediate wide-scale production of penicillin. The technical problems were enormous. The penicillin mold grows only on flat surfaces under carefully controlled conditions. To grow the mold effectively requires literally thousands of square feet of space. Getting proper containers in wartime Britain was virtually impossible. First, the British tried using old-fashioned bedpans with lids to grow the mold, but even these were scarce. Then, a pottery maker agreed to provide containers, and Dr. Chain drove 200 miles on a Christmas day to get them for his laboratory. But they could not be made in great enough quantity. And finally, as the war accelerated, Dr. Florey came to the United States to seek help. Several American pharmaceutical companies and government scientists pitched in to develop ways to produce the drug in quantity. Actually, one of the most important techniques for improving penicillin production was developed by scientists from the United States Department of Agriculture, working in Peoria, Illinois. Their work was hailed by researchers the world over. Here is Dr. Chain as he appeared in 1942. Before Mrs. Miller was treated, a few patients in England had received the drug. However, little was known about its true potential against infectious diseases.
The phenomenon of microbial antagonism, that is to say, the capability of microorganisms of one kind of microorganism to produce substances active against other kinds of microorganisms, killing them or inhibiting their growth, has been known since the days of Pasteur, in fact since 1877. And Fleming's paper, published in 1929, was one of about 200 which I discovered on the subject when I made a search of the older literature. Now, it was quite natural and logical that once it had been established that one of these microorganisms, in this particular case Penicillin chrysogenum, could produce a substance of very great value to therapy, penicillin, that a search should have been started for other similar bacteria. These substances are now known under the term antibiotics, and they have led to an effective therapy of practically all the important bacterial infections all over the world, of course.
This is Merck & Company in 1942. Working there then and now was a research scientist, Dr. Harry Robinson. He helped carry out some of the earliest tests of penicillin safety.
In the early 30s, 1932 to be exact, the sulfa drugs appeared on the scene. And the sulfa drugs were a major breakthrough in the treatment of infectious disease. The studies began in this laboratory early in 1941, at a time when we were investigating other potential antibiotics. And the preliminary small amounts of penicillin were made available sometime during the latter part of 1941. We were aware of the fact that our penicillin, which was still in a very crude stage, might have use in man, and that the antibiotic was to be used in New Haven for a very critically ill patient who had an overwhelming sepsis due to a beta hemolytic streptococcus.
Dr. Jack Bumstead, who was my brother's family physician, called the company, as I say, the pharmaceutical company, asked it to be delivered, and they said, yes, we can get it up to you as soon as we can get a state police escort to bring it to you.
I remember specifically how brown everything was. Obviously, I wasn't feeling too happy or high at the time, and the messenger was all dressed in brown. He had a brown suit, brown coat, brown hat, brown hair, brown shoes, and he was carrying a brown paper bag in which the penicillin was contained. And even the penicillin was in a brown bottle. And thereafter, Dr. Bumstead and I walked the floor of the isolation pavilion for about, a good 2 hours while he was trying to determine how he should administer it, how much he should administer it, how often he should administer it, because there wasn't any clinical experience at the time. And he finally decided that he would administer it intravenously in so many, whatever the quantities were, and that he would do it every 4 hours.
In 1942, a lady was dying in this hospital. There was a call for someone to give her intravenous injections during the night of a new drug. All known drugs at this time had failed. This included the sulfa drugs, which at that time were considered the miracle drugs. Her temperature rose to 106. She was in semi-coma. My job during the night was to give her the intravenous injections of this new drug. I at that time did not know who the patient was, nor did I know the name of this drug. I did know that this was a very important new drug.
To try to connect my imperfect remembrances, I can say that late in the day when I was to have another injection, I can't say that I knew what it was. I knew it was a special drug, and that Dr. Bumstead later did say at the time it was soluble in water. That's all that they had been told from where it had come, and that I was to have it very frequently. So every 4 hours I would be given into my vein, and in a matter of 12 hours, I can honestly say the nurse looked at me, and my temperature apparently was changing, and I had a very distinct smell of mustard. It was strong. I smelled English mustard. And at the time, and Dr. Bumstead said, that is interesting, because something about this property of this drug, it does have that odor.
The penicillin was in a flask, and they handed it to me, and the first time that they showed it to me, and they said, this is the medication that we're going to use for her, and guard it with your life because it's like liquid gold. And I remember seeing it in the flask. It was a yellow liquid, and I was quite careful with it. I used to have to get it from the refrigerator, and Dr. Sappington, as I remember, was the intern, and he would give it to her intravenously, and it saved her life.
This new drug, penicillin, was so new that either Dr. Fleming or his associates in England, nor physicians here, obviously not physicians here because it had been none available, had been able to work out a proper dosage for a patient. Therefore, if I recall correctly, Dr. Fulton or Dr. Bumstead did call or cable Dr. Fleming in England to get his advice on what should the dosage be even after they had started dosage, because they did not want to wait to get a call through. They wanted to start with penicillin immediately. As I understand, they started with a very small dose and then gradually increased the dosage over the first few days, and it was given, as I understand, several times in the day, and then finally got a statement from Dr. Fleming, well, I would have to do about the same as you're doing, in other words, try, and we don't know, we haven't been able to work out the dosage here, we haven't used it in England except experimentally.
This was probably one of the most dramatic things I've ever seen, because when prior to the time she had had this medicine, her, let's say her temperature ran high, 102, 103 or more every day. She was obviously desperately ill, and there seemed little chance of saving her. Practically after the first dose of penicillin, her temperature dropped to normal and stayed there with hardly a rise above normal until she was discharged. It was really spectacular. We didn't realize then what a tremendous step this was in the course of treating the infection, but was obvious to us then that this was really a very major step. And I'm sure this is one of the most dramatic things that has ever occurred to me during my medical life.
Penicillin was administered to Mrs. Miller in New Haven, and at the time it was a very precious substance. And of course we knew from our animal experimentation that penicillin administered to animals was largely excreted in the urine, and therefore the thought occurred that it would be desirable to collect all of the urine from Mrs. Miller, bring it back to the Merck laboratories, and attempt to extract it so that it could be used over again. We, of course, were very excited about the possibility of using penicillin to treat this particular case, and therefore all of the people in the laboratory made constant inquiry as to what happened. And of course, the results that came back were extremely exciting and stimulating, in that here this patient who had not responded to all available chemotherapy at that point in time now responded almost overnight with a reduction of this high fever to a normal level. And therefore the news was greeted with great excitement.
4 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts, the telephone rang, and anyone who knew Jack Bumstead would know that he had a very soft voice. And there was a pause when I picked up the telephone and said, "Yes, Jack." And nothing was said for a minute or so. And he said, "You can take a half a breath, but keep your fingers crossed. Anne's temperature is normal." It was a dramatic thing, obviously, and after all those weeks of very, very serious and critical illness, to see the perfectly marvelous change that came over her after the injection of this material for a little while, and the, of course, extremely wonderful nursing care which she had from the people in the hospital and the medical care. It was quite a year and quite an event, and certainly makes one feel not only grateful, of course, extremely grateful, but admiring of the kind of work the medical profession engages in.
Dr. Fleming, having heard of this case, and it was written up extensively at the time in various medical journals, including the AMA and other medical treatises, and he, having heard about it from that source, if not from other sources, came to this country and saw the patient a few weeks after she had been first administered penicillin, examined her record, talked to her physicians, and so on. The upshot of it was that here was a patient not knowing as far as her family was concerned, or the doctors for that matter, whether she was going to survive the next 24 hours or not. Here was a patient who was given Dr. Fleming's discovery, and she made a complete recovery.
Since Mrs. Miller only received about 150,000 units of penicillin over about a 2-week period to cure her illness, we had about half a bottle left over. It just so happened at that time on the same ward we had a patient who had a staphylococcal pneumonia with a staphylococcal septicemia. And that time this was a fatal disease, and we thought we had nothing to lose, so we treated this patient with penicillin in the same dosage that we had used for Mrs. Miller. And the interesting thing is that we also cured him. I might say we cured him with the dregs of the bottle.
I remember I was glad when I finally was finished with the case, even though it was an interesting case, and I was very fond of Mrs. Miller. I was glad when I was finished because I hadn't had a day off for 3 months. But it was very pleasant. Towards the end, I used to take her up on the roof of the hospital, and she'd sit in the sun, and she was gaining strength again after her battle.
I can only say that when you're desperately ill, and I had never been ill before, I have superb health. They've told me then, and I still do. I was spared a lot of the agony that my husband and others were going through. I had a great will to live. My nurses said that you were a wonderful patient, and I can remember replying, I would be too bad if I wouldn't do what I was asked to do with you trying to get me well, when I'd be drinking another glass of fluid, the last thing I wanted. No, I can remember only the joy, the relief, the fact that I was going to be getting out. I went down in weight from 135 to about 95 pounds. And my children I would see out the window. I didn't see them for 3 months. so that I can feel too that the providence who guides us all, or we believe does, my work was not done.
Today at home, Mrs. Miller and her husband visit with neighbors. It all happened more than 30 years ago, Mrs. Miller's gift of life. And now the world cannot count how many lives have been saved by penicillin and the antibiotics that followed. From that early discovery in Great Britain came the next step, the so-called broad-spectrum antibiotics. Penicillin proved effective against a host of infectious diseases, pneumonia, meningitis, strep, syphilis, and others. Because it prevented infection, penicillin opened the way to improved treatment on many fronts. It permitted bolder surgery and led to programs of preventive medicine against many life-threatening illnesses. And now, penicillin can be produced synthetically for still additional improvement in treatment. Dr. Chain, knighted for his work as were Fleming and Fleury, sums it up this way. Penicillin and the later antibiotics have proved effective against virtually every known bacterial infection. But Ann Miller and her husband Ogden are grateful, extremely grateful for her gift of life. Mrs. Miller is living proof of the extraordinary accomplishments of medical science in the United States and the world over.